Okay, I'd like to call the meeting of the Independent Regulatory Review Commission to order. Present today physically on my left is Commissioner Sirocco. On my right, Commissioner Watson. I am Commissioner Bedwick. We will on and off have Commissioner Upberg and I believe Vice Chairman Meisner at various points calling in on the phone and obviously interacting as part of the meeting. With that, if we can, have the members had an opportunity to review the minutes from our last meeting? If so, do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second, all in favor?
Aye.
They are approved. Prior to moving to the action items, we do have what we call embargoed mail that we have not had an opportunity to read at this point. Our statute does not allow us to review any material that comes in within 48 hours of our meeting. So if we can, are all of them on medical marijuana? All the embargoed mail? Okay. We'll take a couple minutes just to go through those now. Have we all had sufficient
I
time?
need
or we
a couple,
little more?
I need a few more minutes, Mr.
Okay.
Chairman.
Yeah. Well, the commissioners are working their way through the embargoed mail. For those of you who aren't familiar with our process, the way we do each regulation is the staff person that's been assigned to the regulation will do a brief presentation to us in terms of background and any outstanding issues there might be. If we had then have the opportunity to ask questions, then the agency would come forward, present their presentation on why they believe the regulation is in the public interest. Again, there's a question period afterwards. Once that's concluded, we then take public comment. And at the conclusion of public comment, the agency is afforded the opportunity to come forward and respond to whatever objections may have been raised as part of public comment. After all of that is done, we then vote on the regulation.
One, my last one.
We're in no rush.
Okay. I'm good, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, with that, the first regulation for consideration today is IRRC Regulation Number 3337 from the State Board of Auctioneer Examiners. Corinne?
This final regulation from the State Board of Auctioneer Examiners provides for graduated application fee increases for auctioneers, apprentice auctioneers, auction companies, trading assistants companies, and special licenses to conduct auctions, and the fee to approve courses. The rulemaking also implements graduated biennial renewal fee increases for auctioneers, apprentice auctioneers, auction companies, trading assistants, and trading assistance companies. We have not received any public comments on the final regulation, and the standing committees have deemed the regulation approved.
Thank you, Corinne. I am the monitor on this regulation. I don't have any questions of staff. Do any of the commissioners have any questions of staff? Hearing none. If the state board could come forward. Good morning. If you both, for our record, could indicate your names and positions, and then go from there.
My name is Jason Murray. I'm the
Is that microphone on? It should be a red light.
There you go.
There we are. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, members of the commission. I'd like to thank the analysts for their review and work on this regulation and their presentation this morning to the commission. I also like to thank the commission for having us here today. I don't have much to add from what's already been presented this morning and through our documents that we presented to the commission. But the board is asking for to increase the fees for basically its applications and renewals as outlined in the final annex. The board currently is operating in a deficit due to rising costs that has experienced over time because it hasn't increased its fees since 2015. And because of that, deficit is now in need of an increase to help alleviate that growing deficit. The board finds that the graduated fee increase is reasonable because the increases are designed to bring the fees into alignment with the board's current costs for processing the applications and to account for the increases in the board's expenses that have occurred over the last 7 years. Therefore, we ask this honorable commission to approve the regulation as presented, and obviously I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone may have.
I do not have any questions. I would just express to the board our appreciation that you're trying to stay on top of fees. We run into situations where it's 15, 20 years, and then people come in with the fee increase proposal, and it's a massive increase. So the more frequently you do them as needed, the less pain it creates for those in the regulated community. Do any other commissioners have any questions of the board? Hearing none, anyone here from the public that would like to comment on this regulation? Hearing none, I neglected to indicate that if either or both of the other commissioners are not on the phone as we take the vote, they have submitted proxies. So we would use those. Do I have a motion to approve? It is my regulation, so I'll move that it's in the public interest and meets the intent and the statutory authority of the General Assembly, and I would move for its approval.
Second.
Moved and seconded. If you can call the roll, Maddie.
The motion has been made for approval of Regulation 3337. Commissioner Uffberg,
Proxy, aye.
Vice Chairman Meisner,
Proxy, aye.
Commissioner Watson,
Aye.
Commissioner Sirocco,
Aye.
Chairman Bedwick.
Aye.
The motion passes 5-0.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
You too. The next regulation is IRRC regulation number 3354 from the State Board of Education. And Laura.
Good morning, Commissioners. This final omitted regulation amends 22 PA Code Chapters 11 and 12 by making technical amendments to the compulsory school ages to lower the age of school attendance to 6 years of age and raise the age of school attendance to 18 years of age. The amendments to these chapters are intended to conform the regulations to the definition of compulsory school age in the Public School Code of 1949. No comments have been received on the final omitted regulation, and both the House and Senate committees have deemed it approved. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Commissioner Sirocco, do you have any questions of staff?
No question.
Any other commissioners?
No.
None. Thank you, Laura. Who is here from the State Board? Come on up. And again, if you can, oh, Karen, yeah, if you can identify
Good morning. I'm Karen
yourself.
Molchano, Executive Director of the State Board of Education.
Go ahead.
I don't have too much more to add to the summary that was provided by staff. We are pursuing final omit regulations to make technical amendments to provisions within Chapter 11 and Chapter 12 of the State Board of Education regulations to conform the regulation with changes to the definition of compulsory school code that previously were adopted by the General Assembly. There had been some requests for this clarity from school attendance officers so that both statute and regulation are clear in the ages for compulsory school attendance that they are to be enforcing.
Thank you. Commissioner Sirocco?
No question. None.
Watson. I have a question that's irrelevant, frankly, since we're past 2019. In looking at the statute that the change was made in, the effective dates baffled me. the sections that change the age, in one portion of the effective date provision said it was effective in 60 days. Then you go down a couple little bullet points and said it was effective in 90 days. And was there ever any real clarity to what was intended by that?
I don't know that I can answer that question on behalf of the General Assembly.
yeah.
Whether it was 60 days or 90 days, enough time has passed that the change is in effect and has been in practice in schools for at least 2 years.
Sure, that's why I said it was irrelevant. It just, it had me confused. Anyone here from the public that would like to comment on this regulation? Seeing no one, Maddie, I'm sorry, Commissioner Soroka, would you like to make a motion?
I find that this regulation is within the board's authority to promulgate regulations and is in the public interest. Therefore, I move for its approval.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded that the regulation be approved. Maddie, please call the roll.
The motion has been made for approval of Regulation 3354. Commissioner Uffberg,
Proxy I.
Vice Chairman Meisner,
Proxy I.
Commissioner Watson,
Aye.
Commissioner Sirocco,
Aye.
Chairman Bedwick.
Aye.
The motion passes 5-0.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The next regulation for consideration is IRRC Regulation Number 3263 from the State Architects Licensure Board. And Corinne.
This final regulation is the first of the three on the agenda today on the same subject matter. The other professional design boards have similar proposals to this, that they are the State Registration Board for Professional Engineers, Land Surveyors, and Geologists, and the State Board of Landscape Architects. This particular regulation from the State Architects Licensure Board updates its existing regulations to provide for the use of digital seals and digital signatures and seals on architectural documents. It sets forth the definitions and requirements for use, including provisions to address the surrender of and compromised digital signatures and seals. We have not received any public comments on the final regulation, and the standing committees have deemed the regulation approved. That's all I have.
Thank you, Corinne. Commissioner Watson,
No questions of staff.
Commissioner Sirocco.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you, Corinne. And who do we have from the State Board? Seeing a lot of familiar faces today. You guys know the drill, so.
Thanks, sir.
Okay, thank you, sir. I appreciate your time. I'm the board counsel. My name is Bill Fritz, board counsel for the State Architects Licensure Board. I'm also the board counsel for the other two boards that are presenting today as well.
I'm Jacqueline Wolfgang, Senior Regulatory Counsel for.
Sorry. I want to thank your staff as well. They did an excellent job with the analysis of the bill and a description of the regulation, sorry. I just want to point out every board's act has a requirement that stamps and seals be used on all drawings. This regulation is just catching us up with the profession throughout the country, getting away from the metal, or some people refer to them as wet stamps and seals, and allowing the licensees to use digital seals and signatures. And in drafting this regulation on this bill, or this regulation and the other regulations as well, the board worked with other agencies, most notably Department of Transportation, and helping to draft the language. There are several other state agencies that employ licensees of this board and the Engineer Board and Landscape Architect Board. This will now allow them to use those digital seals and signatures as well. I'm open if you have any questions.
Commissioner Watson?
I have no questions. Thank you very much for updating, please.
Commissioner Sirocco?
No questions.
Anyone here from the public that would like to comment? Seeing none? Would you like to make a motion, Commissioner Watson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find that this regulation is within the board's authority to promulgate regulations and that the regulation is in the public interest. I therefore move for its approval.
I will second. It's been moved and seconded that the regulation be approved. Maddie, if you would call the roll, please.
The motion has been made for approval of Regulation 3263. Commissioner Ufberg,
Proxy I.
Vice Chairman Meisner,
Proxy I.
Commissioner Watson,
Aye.
Commissioner Sirocco,
Aye.
Chairman Bedwick.
Aye.
The motion passes 5-0.
Okay, we're all set. If you want, on the other regulations, as you come forward for those, if there's something unique you want to mention about that one, otherwise and again, it's up to you, feel free to just say the rationale is the same as was on this one.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you. Next regulation is IRRC Regulation Number 3264, and that's from the State Board for Professional Engineers, Land Surveyors, and Geologists. Michelle.
Good morning. This final regulation from the State Registration Board for Professional Engineers, Land Surveyors, and Geologists updates its current regulations on signatures and seals to make them as consistent as possible with the other design professional boards, as Corinne mentioned. The regulation enables licensees to increase electronic communications, electronic commerce, and filing of documents via electronic means through the use of digital seals and signatures. And we have not received any public comments on the final regulation, and the standing committees have deemed this approved. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Commissioner Sirocco, do you have any questions of staff?
No questions, thank you.
Commissioner Watson?
None.
None. Thank you, Michelle. State Board, if you want to come forward. Oh, you could have stayed here, I'm sorry.
Good exercise.
There you go.
Thank you, sir. Again, my name is Bill Fritz, Board Counsel for the Engineer Board, and
Jacqueline Wolfgang, Senior Regulatory Counsel for Department of State.
And again, thank you to your staff. They've been a great help with these regulations. I really have no other, nothing else to mention. The rationale for this regulation is the same as the previous regulation.
Thank you. Commissioner Sirocco, any questions of the board?
No questions, thank you.
Commissioner Watson?
None.
I have none. Anyone here from the public who would like to comment on this regulation? Seeing none, Commissioner Sirocco, would you like to make a motion?
Find that this regulation is within the board's authority to promulgate regulations and that the regulation is in the public interest. Therefore, I move for its approval.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. If you could call the roll, Maddie, please.
The motion has been made for approval of Regulation 3264. Commissioner Ufberg,
Proxy I.
Vice Chairman Meisner,
Proxy I.
Commissioner Watson,
Aye.
Commissioner Sirocco,
Aye.
Chairman Bedwick.
Aye.
The motion passes 5-0.
Thank you. You guys can stay there. Save you some exercise. The next regulation for consideration is IRRC Regulation Number 3265, and that's from the State Board of Landscape Architects. Laura?
This final form regulation amends 49 PA Code, Chapter 15, to establish technical standards for digital seals and signatures used by landscape architects on work products. The amendments to this chapter also add definitions and clarify requirements for metal seals, digital seals, and rubber stamps. No comments have been received on the final form regulation, and the House and Senate committees have deemed it approved. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Any commissioners have any questions of staff?
No.
Hearing none, I would indicate for our record, the same two individuals who addressed the previous regulation are also here to address this regulation. I'll save you from having to say your names again. And if you want to comment, please feel free.
Thank you, sir. We really don't have any additional comments. The rationale for this regulation is the same as the prior two regulations that were presented.
Anyone from the public who wishes to comment? Seeing none, I find this regulation to be within the board's statutory authority, within legislative intent, and also in the public interest, and I would move for its approval.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Maddie, please.
The motion has been made for approval of Regulation 3265. Commissioner Ufberg,
Proxy I.
Vice Chairman Meisner,
Proxy I.
Commissioner Watson,
Aye.
Commissioner Sirocco,
Aye.
Chairman Bedwick.
Aye.
The motion passes 5-0.
Thank you both.
Thank you very much.
The next regulation, what I would like to do is if we can take a break for 5 minutes, and David will text both commissioners just to let them know we're beginning this regulation, and if they're able to get on the phone, they will. Both had prior conflicts, unfortunately, but we want to at least give them the opportunity to get on if they have some free time right now. I'll call the meeting back to order. The next regulation is IRRC Regulation Number 3290. It's from the Department of Health, and deals with medical marijuana. And we have both Scott and Michelle for this one.
Good morning.
Morning.
The Commonwealth's Medical Marijuana Program was created in 2016 by the Medical Marijuana Act. The Act provided the department with temporary rulemaking authority that was exempt from the formal rulemaking process. The department used that authority to establish the program. The department, through this rulemaking, now seeks to promulgate permanent regulations to replace the current temporary regulations. This rulemaking incorporates substantive changes made to the Medical Marijuana Act by Act 44 of 2021. An important aspect of Act 44 was the codification of the temporary measures implemented in response to COVID-19. This includes curbside pickup, increasing the supply limit of a prescription from 30 to 90 days, telemedicine, and increasing the number of patients for whom a person may act as a caregiver. We have received comments from the regulated community that oppose some aspects of the rulemaking. An issue raised by several commentators is the new requirement for medical marijuana to be tested by 2 different labs as it is processed. Members of the regulated community are here today and will be discussing that and some other issues. Both designated standing committees have deemed the regulation approved. However, I would like to note that we received a letter from Representative Kathy Rapp, Majority Chair of the House Health Committee, and 7 members of that committee expressing concern with the 2-lab issue. They believe the regulation conflicts with the corresponding statutory provision of the Act that was recently amended by Act 44. They also question the reasonableness of the requirement and the associated cost of it. You have the embargoed mail, and you've had a chance to review that, so that's all we have right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Do any commissioners have questions of staff?
None.
Oh, no. Thank you both. Before we bring the department up, I would indicate, based on what Scott said, where there are concerns with some particular provisions. The scope for us is an all or nothing. Just, I want to make sure everybody's aware of that. We cannot approve everything but one provision. We either approve the whole thing or we disapprove the whole thing. Having said that, Department of Health. Good morning.
Good morning.
And if you would identify yourselves, please.
Good morning. I am Dr. Denise Johnson, the Acting Secretary of Health and Physician General.
I'm Laura Mensch. I'm the Director of the Office of Medical Marijuana.
Hello, I'm Mariah Turner. I'm Assistant Counsel to the Department of Health.
Great. Well, good morning, Chairman Bedwick and commissioners, commissioner staff, and the public. Thank you for this opportunity to come before you this morning to discuss the department's medical marijuana regulations, which are before the commission today. The department began the promulgation process for these extremely important regulations within 6 months of passage of the Medical Marijuana Act, as the act required. As you heard, by passing certain regulatory requirements such as the public comment period, the drafting of the preamble, and providing response to comments and a hearing before this commission. Recognizing the need for transparency and the importance of input from the public and the legislature, the department created an informal regulation drafting process for the temporary regulations, posting draft regulations chapter by chapter on its website and seeking public comment and meeting with legislative stakeholders to discuss those comments and the drafting of the temporary regulations. Neither the General Assembly, through its passage of the Act, nor the department ever intended that the medical marijuana program run indefinitely on regulations that had not been vetted through the regulatory review process. As such, the department used considerable knowledge learned under those temporary regulations to make programmatic changes that benefit both the patients who need this medication as well as the entities that make the medication possible. In the final regulations, as they are presented to the Commission today, include changes made from temporary to proposed regulations and from proposed regulations to final. During each step of this process, the department took into consideration comments from stakeholders, the General Assembly, and the public. The department's touchstone for drafting these final regulations has been to effectuate the intent of the General Assembly to create a program that balances the needs of patients to have access to these medications, meaning medical marijuana, with the need to protect patient safety. The department has continually weighed patient safety with the needs of the businesses, and we'd like to take the time to address how it strongly believes in 2 key provisions as both essential for public health, safety, and welfare. First, the 2 separate laboratory test requirements, and the second, I'll talk about the route of administration dosage language. For both of these issues, the regulations prioritize patient safety over expediency, and they represent the best interests of patients. To start off with, lab test manipulation is a clear problem across the industry nationwide. In 2019, an Oregon audit found that the state's program could not ensure that test results were reliable or that the products were safe. In May 2022, Oklahoma had to recall 99 products due to labs passing products which failed yeast, mold, aspergillus, E. coli testing. In Nevada, a lab is facing license revocation for several lab manipulation citations, chiefly routinely passing samples that had been previously failed testing for pesticides, microtoxins, heavy metals, microbials, and all regulated contaminants. Arkansas, a class action lawsuit was filed against a lab for allegedly violating federal racketeering law by intentionally inflating THC percentages in medical marijuana products that it sells to patients. So instead of allowing lab test manipulations to gain a foothold and fester in our program, the department is taking proactive measures to protect vulnerable patients from harmful contaminants. Because the statute requires grower processors to have 2 tests at harvest and process, any additional expense should be nominal and does not outweigh the need to protect patients. The department's solution is a reasonable resolution contemplated in the Act and consistent with the legislative mandate to protect patients. Lastly, this interlaboratory test comparison, or round-robin testing, is a common practice for quality assurance for laboratories accredited according to the ISO 17025, and Nevada's medical marijuana program has used round-robin testing of its own. The second issue, the department has a responsibility to ensure patients receive safe and effective medical marijuana. From the beginning, the department has considered several factors when determining whether or not to approve a product, especially those with added substances. The department wishes to memorialize that it also considers the route of administration, the dosage, and drug interactions when determining whether to approve an added substance, like other agencies would for mainstream medications. It is paramount in this relatively new industry where the product is sold to a particularly vulnerable population that any additive does not extend the maximum daily exposure nor added to a medical marijuana form that is not proven safe to consume by that particular route of administration. The department does not want to be in a position where only we review a product that is permitted for use in food and approve it for another route of administration. We do not want to be in the position to deal with an issue such as the e-cigarette vaping lung-associated injury, or EVALI, outbreak, which caused deaths in previously healthy individuals. The department is not violating nor intends to violate the court order in the matter before the Commonwealth Court. The department will continue to abide by the court order until the question of statutory authority is fully litigated and resolved. The department has determined that reviewing these considerations are not only reasonable, but in the best interest of the patient. The department strongly believes that these final regulations are necessary for the department to continue to provide safe and effective medication to patients. Therefore, we ask you to approve the department's medical marijuana regulations, and the department will be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you. Do any commissioners have any questions?
No questions.
Yes.
Go ahead, please. Commissioner Sirocco.
Thank you. Turning just to the issue of the, I think it's deemed the harvest lot testing and the process lot testing, those are the 2 tests.
Correct.
And if I understood your very helpful testimony correctly, your point is that it makes good sense from a health point of view to have a different laboratory doing each of those tests.
Correct.
As opposed to having the same laboratory doing both tests.
That's correct, Commissioner.
But concern has been raised as to whether there is in Act 44 an adequate and sufficient basis for such a regulation by your department to be put forward. And if I'm understanding the department's position correctly, the department in justifying that concept, which I'm not even getting into the science or the medical aspects of or the health aspects of, I'm just looking at the language now. It's that language that refers to, quote, one or more independent laboratories.
Correct, Commissioner.
And that's the language, if I'm understanding the department's position correctly, that you see in Act 44 as supporting a requirement that a different lab do the harvest lot testing and a different lab do the process lot testing.
That's correct. According to Act 44, one or more tests, and based on patient safety and the need to protect patients, our proposal then is for 2 separate tests.
Can I just clarify, she means 2 separate laboratories?
Correct, yes.
Yes, I understood that, thank you. But again, just looking at the language, and again, not get into the issue of patient safety. I accept what you say about that, not getting into the issue of the health benefits and not getting into the science, but just looking at the language you need to base your regulations on. One or more, it's hard to equate that with 2, because better language would have said 2 or more than 1. When language says 1 or more, that's commonly understood to mean it could be 1. And I'm struggling because a very reasonable interpretation of Act 44, and some might say the more reasonable interpretation is that the industry checks the required box when it in fact contracts with an independent laboratory to do required testing. And I'm struck by the notion, want to discuss it and understand it better and get your reaction to it, but it seems that someone might reasonably say you're embroidering onto this an extra requirement, might be one that I understand in your judgment makes sense, might be one that I understand in your judgment relates to patient safety, understand that might be in your judgment something that's a good idea, but I'm a little concerned that you're out somewhere in thin air with that 2 separate testing lab requirement, and the justification for it speaks to language that I'm not sure is best interpreted the way you would need to interpret it to find within Act 44 a basis for your proposed regulation in respect of these 2 testing labs. And I'm just struggling with that and would ask for your assistance or the assistance of your colleagues on some or any of that, because it's a concern in my mind.
Yes, Commissioner, if I may, I will ask Mariah Turner to comment more specifically on that language.
Thank you.
Yes, so thank you, Commissioner, for the question. I think it's important to first note that when the department proposed this regulation in March, the language said an approved laboratory, an independent laboratory. And then based off of the comments that we received at that time, the argument was that we didn't have the statutory authority from that. And then what appears to be...
Stop right there. You lost me, I'm sorry.
Yes.
I understand there was some initial proposed language, but I then didn't understand your follow-up comment.
Yes, so
I want to be closely with you on this.
we've proposed the same language that is in the final regulation package now. So on proposed, we did the 2 lab testing. And our reasoning for doing that was that Section 704's language requires an approved laboratory. The commentators said that that language of an improved laboratory doesn't give us the authority. And that was obviously very contentious, very public, and the comments did go to have been seen by the legislature. And then Act 44 amended the language to one or more independent laboratories, bolstering the department's interpretation that the General Assembly was giving us the deference to decide on whether or not we needed that 2 lab testing after we weighed the competing interest. And since this came out before the final form had to be finalized, there was always the chance that the department would have determined that that wasn't the right way to go. And because having separate lab tests is in the best interest of patient safety, and looking at the overall intent and the scope of the act, the department determined that we do have the statutory authority to use that, and that to ignore the or more language is treating it as mere surplusage, and under the rules of statutory construction, if a statute, if possible, can be construed to give all of its provisions effect, it should be. And I do want to point to you made a comment where you said there is reasonable arguments, and they may have the more reasonable. There's supporting case law that when there's 2 reasonable interpretations of the statute, that the deference goes to the body responsible for enforcing that authority.
Why doesn't it say 2 or more?
So again, at the time when Act 44 went, the department was still in the process of finalizing the final form, and the General Assembly was not aware whether or not we would have went in the other way and agreed with the commentators that we didn't want to follow with the final regulations were promulgated. And part of making these regulations is to be within the scope of what is allowed in the act. And while the General Assembly could have done 2 or more, again, the department believes that they were allowing the program to decide whether or not they were going to continue with this regulation based off of what are the competing interests and whether the public safety outweighed the fiscal impacts brought up by the stakeholders.
So you're really interpreting 1 or more independent laboratories as 1 or more than 1 independent laboratory.
I mean, so we're interpreting it as that the statute requires a minimum of 1 laboratory, and that if the department determined that it's in the best interest of public health and safety, that it would be within the scope to include 1 more laboratory than the 1 minimum laboratory. Or, I mean, arguably more and so forth, since it just says or more.
Thank you.
Just as a follow-up, so I understand, I'll call it the original act, I don't know if it was amended in between or not, provided clear language for 1 laboratory, an independent laboratory.
Yes, it did say an independent laboratory.
And then was it Act 44?
Yes.
Change that to 1 or more?
Correct.
Okay. And your interpretation is, not saying whether I agree or disagree, but I just want to understand the issue. Your interpretation is that the intent of that was to provide a statutory basis for the department to require more than one?
Yes.
I understand the argument. I'm sorry, Commissioner Watson.
No, no questions.
He has no questions. Just a couple of issues for me. First of all, I appreciate the presentation. It was very helpful. I just want to confirm what I understand the testimony to have been, and that of concern to me was the language regarding the additives. And if I understood correctly, it's in the regulation. You would not do anything with that language since there's currently an injunction on an action the department had taken prior to this regulation being presented. But it is there only if one of two things occurs. The court decides in your favor in that action that's going on in court, that you do have that authority, or the legislature amends the act to provide clear statutory authority. But the main concern to me is that you're not going to utilize that language while the court case is going on. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, absolutely, Chairman. We intend to continue to abide by the court order, this current order, or any future orders as well. So the IRRC's approval or disapproval of this regulation will not affect the way the department proceeds. The status quo will remain in effect unless there's a change in the court order.
Thank you. Now I'm going to get into the weeds, probably to you. One area that was of interest to me throughout the process were the diversity provisions as they existed in the statute and as they are carried into this regulation. I am pleased with what's in the regulation. I had some difficulty working my way through it, and I want to make sure that my interpretation is correct. The statute had referred to diverse groups and defined what they were. When I got to the regulation, it was very true to the definition in terms of diverse groups. There was an additional definition added for diverse participants, which was something new that I hadn't seen in the statute. In working my way through everything, what it looks to me like is diverse groups are businesses, and they apply the diversity of provisions apply to them as businesses in terms of receiving permits or contracting by permittees with these diverse, quote, groups. Diverse participants, which is new, is a much broader category. And I was reading that as applying to employment opportunities rather than contracting opportunities. It's probably self-evident, but the question on the definition of diverse participant is it includes disabled people and it includes veterans. In terms of diverse businesses, the statute included among the definition for that disabled veterans. And I'm assuming, and I just want to confirm, that disabled veterans will fall somewhere within one of the two categories under participants, and that is either veterans or disabled. Is that
that's
fair to
correct.
say? Okay, I mean, it seems self-evident, but this is an important provision to me, and I want to make sure it's accurate. I'm not quite, and I'm pleased, but I'm not quite sure you haven't set up in terms of the definition for diverse participant, something that may not include everybody. But that's up to you guys. I don't have a problem with that, but I appreciate you confirming at least what I understood things to be. Any other commissioners with questions? They're not on the phone yet? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, may I
Yes,
ask a question?
please.
This is field from the previous questions, and it deals with the recommendations of the advisory board. As I understand, the Act 44, previously, recommendations of the advisory board could be implemented as a regulation. Could you explain the going forward procedure?
I'm assuming you're talking about the serious medical conditions.
Yes.
Yes. Would you like to handle that, or do you want me to?
Sure. So there is an application process to add a serious medical condition to the list. And so that certifying physicians may do this. They have access to that application. That application then goes to a committee of the advisory board. And that committee includes medical professionals and others who will vet the scientific information and vet that application. They then make a recommendation to the board, the advisory board, and that recommendation could be adopted or not by the board. And then that goes as a recommendation to the Secretary of Health, who then can effectuate that regulation and add it as a serious medical condition.
So upon the concurrence of the secretary and then the publication, it becomes a regulation. It does not have to come back to here?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'm assuming there's some people here from the public who would wish to come forward. David, do we have a list or? No? If we don't, that's fine.
list.
Okay. Thank you.
There's just a handful, so.
Okay. Come on up. Now you clearly have to identify yourself since. Meredith, I know. I don't know any of the others.
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
If you can all identify yourselves, or one of you identify everybody, whatever works best. And if you're representing a group, if you could please let us know that.
Absolutely. I'm Nikki Moyers. I am the VP of Product and Brand Compliance for Tilt Holdings, the parent company for Standard Farms, a GP operator in the Northeast region.
Okay.
My name's Meredith Buettner. I'm the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Cannabis Coalition. We represent approximately 75% of the permit holders here in the Pennsylvania Medical Marijuana Program.
Thank you.
Good morning, Commissioners. Judith Castle from Cannabis Law, PA, and we represent a plethora of the grower processors, dispensaries, laboratories, physicians, healthcare facilities, clinical registrants in the state of Pennsylvania that are under the medical marijuana program.
Good morning. Shannon Hoffman. I'm the Regional Director of Operations for Green Analytics. We have labs in 6 states, including the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and we operate at Steep Hill, Pennsylvania, here in Harrisburg.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Commissioners, IRRC is such a good and necessary part of the regulatory review process. You, the commissioners, unbiased and untethered to political aspirations of an agency, provide real substantive review for regulations. And we appreciate the honor of being in front of you. And I know, as Commissioner Bedwick pointed out, that I'm asking for you to deny the entirety of the department's regulations by coming here and asking that you decide one of those regulations is so egregious that it cannot move forward. But this is the process that we're all bound to. And so, yes, I am asking for this drastic measure because only you can stop this single egregious regulation from becoming law. The regulation that I'm asking that you not allow to become law is 1171A29C, where DOH inexplicably abdicates its role for direct oversight of the labs. DOH hands its oversight responsibility to the very labs it is tasked with regulating. In the most confusing and nonsensical manner, Section 1171A 29C states that every grower processor must have 2 tests done, at the plant stage and at the finished product stage. But then DOH takes a 90-degree turn away from the statute, and it mandates that grower processors choose one lab for the plant and a completely different lab for the end product. Now, just to give you you may already know this, but just to give you a flavor of what the process is from the plant to the end product, pills, tinctures, creams, ointments, vape products, they go through various processes: supercritical CO2 extractions, decarboxylate extractions, drying processes where terpenes, flavonoids, THC, CBD, all those things are either pulled out, put back in, minimized, or changed in some way. It is not the same product that is being tested at the plant phase as the final product. So, DOH claims that having 2 different laboratories test at those 2 different phases will provide a check and balance. It will not. The regulation on its face makes no sense. How would 2 different labs using 2 different testing processes at 2 very different points in the process provide any check and balance on each other? So what happens if these 2 laboratories testing these 2 different products at 2 different phases come up with 2 different results? What happens? What's the method for reconciliation? 1171-29A 29C doesn't provide for a reconciliation. Who's right? Who's wrong? What happens if the product's just sitting, rotting, while we try to figure out which laboratory had the right results? DOH is already backed up over 6 months in just getting approvals to start this process. New products have to go through DOH for approval. And they're 6 months or more behind in authorizing those approvals or denials. And so now we add thousands of tests that conflict with each other to the DOH tasks. Not only does this regulation lead to irreconcilable confusion and wasted products, it hurts patients by reducing the safety built into the system right now, where one lab may test the product as it's coming from plant to end product the whole way along the way with the same processes, same equipment, same personnel. Give some consistency to the testing and some faith with patients that the tests are being done consistently with state-of-the-art equipment. Lastly, this regulation takes business away from those labs who have invested in equipment and people and processes that are state-of-the-art, that are cutting edge, that are efficient. It takes business right away from them and hands it to some of the other labs who may not deserve it. Why? Why would DOH implement this nonsensical and damaging regulation, one that has no purpose on its face? One has to wonder if the idea was not proposed by a lab that's not doing business currently. And it's eager for DOH to hand them business. It did not come from another state. There is no other state in the union that does this type of processes, where labs are supposed to cross-check themselves, police themselves, regulate themselves in a nonsensical manner. And it was brought up by Department of Health earlier that this provides a round robin. That is not what they are proposing. This 2 different tests at 2 different phases is not a round robin. There are states that implement round robin, and that's using the same phase tests and shipping the product samples around to different labs so they can cross-check themselves. That might be a good idea. But most states set up their own labs or contract with a third-party independent lab to directly regulate the labs, so they directly know what's going on in the laboratories. And so they know they can have that cross-check. They know they can have those checks and balances. This system provides 0 checks and balances. The IRRA requires that IRRC determine whether 1171A 29C is in the public interest. A regulation is not in the public interest if it's promulgated by an agency that does not have the statutory authority to do so. And as Commissioner Sirocco pointed out, the statutory authority is quite the opposite of what DOH is attempting to do. And there's some real nuanced differences here that weren't pointed out earlier. The act as changed in June of 2021, first of all, it was changed after DOH promulgated this regulation. So the legislature knew full well that DOH wanted this 2-lab testing thing. They could have codified it, as Commissioner pointed out. Not only did they not codify that, they went the other way and said the grower processors may choose 1 or 2 labs to perform these tests. Notice that.
For the record, I wasn't pointing anything out. I was asking questions.
Sorry.
Of the witness.
That's fair.
I was not advocating anything. I was getting information.
Thank you for your correction. I appreciate that. And I will note that your question raises this other question, that the legislature knew DOH's interest in putting those 2 labs together, and they didn't codify it. In fact, they went the other way and said grower processors shall pick 1 or more labs to do these 2 different testings. They didn't say DOH can choose, which is what was inferred here by DOH members, that somehow the legislature had given that authority to DOH. Quite the contrary. If you read the exact verbiage of that of the act, it says grower processors may choose 1 or more, not DOH may choose 1 or more. And then it goes on in the next sentence to say that DOH shall approve a lab to do both those testing. There's no way to get around the language. And that language was modified after DOH told the legislature what they wanted to do. That's very important timing and very important on the nuance of the verbiage that it contains in Act 44. So we recommend that this body send the regulations back to be corrected. It has been 6 years. We've been working under temporary regulations. 60 more days to get this right is not a hindrance to anybody that's in the industry right now. And certainly DOH should directly regulate these labs. They can set up a third-party lab. They can contract with the accreditation entity that currently makes sure that the labs are accredited. They could do a myriad of things. They could do a true round robin. But having 2 different laboratories test 2 different, very different products at 2 different times doesn't achieve the legislative purpose. And also, I will note, by DOH's own admission in their comments back to you, there's no problem here that they're trying to solve. They admit that there's no problem in Pennsylvania, that the current regulations have been working. And I think that their lack of answering this commission's specific, serious questions also is an indication why this regulation should be sent back to be corrected. And I yield to my co-people.
Do you want to go next since you're still talking about lab stuff? My comments are more general, so I'll let you stay on the lab track.
I'm sure you'll be surprised that I have some comments about the 2-lab system, but before I get to that, I have some other comments, so it's a little breather. Thank you for the opportunity to provide our public comments. Steep Hill, Pennsylvania is an ISO 17025 accredited laboratory conducting analytical and microbial testing as part of a network of laboratories operating in 6 highly regulated cannabis markets. We have many concerns regarding the proposed final laboratory regulations and their intended implementation. Our first area of concern relates to laboratory testing at the practical level. Several pieces of critical testing information have been omitted or inconsistently applied, which could threaten patient safety and render regulations ineffective. These are outlined in detail in written comments provided by Dr. Daniel Neeson. To summarize, the proposed regulations abandon the guidance which the laboratories have used for operation for the entirety of the program. They differ significantly from the current standards, while omitting critical information such as batch sizes and contaminants and pathogens to be tested. They require information in MJ Freeway, which the system is not currently capable of collecting, including but not limited to inventory information for stability testing, selection and reporting of R&D testing, and results for many of the analytes included in this revision. While these issues were brought to the DOH's attention in previous comments, they've chosen not to address them and stated as much in their own commentary. The absence of critical components of the guidance in the final regulation removed the necessary safeguards for the Pennsylvania patients. This incomplete work product will have direct impact on patient safety because the state-approved laboratories will be left to choose their own patient safety standards. Okay, now for the topic that everybody wants to hear more about. Our second area of concern is the proposed 2-lab system, which is outlined in detail in the comments provided by Dr. Andrew Rosenstein. This two-lab system egregiously restricts the free market while ostensibly offering checks and balances for the laboratories to regulate one another. However, DOH has failed to provide any explanation of how this regulation would happen. The DOH needs to take on the task of regulating labs through inspections, proficiency testing, third-party inspections, Judy alluded to. The round-robin testing is a great option, which we urge the DOH to take on, but the two-lab system, as Judy pointed out, is not round-robin testing. Round-robin testing consists of selecting a sample for all of the labs to test, and then comparing the results and seeing if one is far off from the other. There are a myriad of options that don't rely on restricting market competition. The two-lab system would add unnecessary complexity to the operations of GPs, resulting in delays and additional costs for patients. It will certainly fail to provide any enhancement to the program and will only serve to punish laboratories who overperform while potentially promoting lab shopping and allow bad actors to go unchecked. And I would like to state for the record, DOH referenced an Arkansas lawsuit regarding potency falsehoods. That lawsuit's been dropped, and I would like that to go on record. It was unfounded. DOH has unequivocally failed to respond to the IRRC request and commentators to justify this regulatory change. DOH was unable to provide evidence of how this change benefits public safety, health, and welfare. The proposed two-lab system is unclear, unreasonable, and disruptive. The proposal will financially strain the small businesses of Pennsylvania. I agree with the concerns that the acting secretary addressed. They are real, but the two-lab system will not address them in any manner. IRRC has the ability and responsibility to force the DOH to provide appropriate regulations that ensure safe medication for the patients of Pennsylvania. The only way that IRRC can fulfill this mandate is to completely reject this poorly thought out, incomplete effort of regulatory change from the DOH. Thank you.
My name is Meredith Buettner. I'm with the Pennsylvania
Mr. Chairman, may I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Is it your position that the entire proposed regulations should be rejected today?
Yes, sir, it is.
Thank you.
Okay, Meredith.
The Pennsylvania Cannabis Coalition, as I mentioned earlier, represents about 75% of the current permit holders here in the program. Over the 6-year life of the program, our members have delivered medicine safely and securely to qualifying patients in a highly regulated environment. Notwithstanding that the medical marijuana office operated without senior leadership for much of 2022, we appreciate that the leadership of the department has shown a renewed interest in the program and are engaging with members to address program-wide issues. Additionally, we are enthusiastic about the leadership and approach the program's new director, Laura Mensch, has demonstrated during her short but meaningful tenure with the department. Though not apparent in the final form regulations, we are encouraged by this recent engagement and commitment to the renewed partnership between regulator and regulated. We thank Independent Regulatory Review Commission Chairman George Bedwick for his persistence helping facilitate this refreshed relationship.
Thank you, and that's a function, I appreciate that, but that's a function of the commission. We have an obligation to try and get the parties to reach consensus, but thank you, it's kind of you to say.
Thank you, Chairman. While much of the final form regulations continue to be overly burdensome for operators, patients, and practitioners alike, and are still not reflective of industry best practices, there are areas of improvement from the proposed final regulations. The department's use of the preamble to provide clarity regarding issues such as visitor access and that a patient identification card is sufficient to enter a dispensary are helpful and representative of attention to comments submitted during the regulatory review process. Our hope is that the department will continue to issue sub-regulatory guidance when clarity is broadly sought. There are many regulations where the regulated community has already indicated the necessity of sub-regulatory guidance, including those related to labeling and medical professionals. Additionally, revisions were made to the regulations related to product transportation, onboarding employees prior to affiliation, and elimination of a prohibition on advertising discounts, which are all welcome amendments. These small fixes aid in bringing the program in line with operational protocol from other jurisdictions. In acknowledgement of statutory requirements reflected in the regulations, PCC's written comments are focused on areas where IRRC has jurisdiction in evaluating regulations. Areas of continued concern include, but are not limited to, the definition of medical marijuana unit, which has a potential to decrease program efficiency, the proposed ability of the department to issue sanctions related to community impact statements without the opportunity for operators to amend such statements to account for current business and market conditions, the conflict between statute and regulation as related to security and surveillance, the lack of consideration for operational costs associated with proposed packaging requirements, and the continued insistence on unnecessary and duplicative testing, all of which drive patient costs while providing no additional patient safety. And lastly, our favorite issue of the day, the department's choice to solve a non-existent testing issue through a logistically and financially burdensome new testing protocol that conflicts with industry standards and will likely cause the very problems the department seeks to avoid while negatively impacting patient costs. And I would like to note that I think Scott mentioned the comments received from Chairwoman Rapp of the Health Committee. Our organization worked really closely with Chairwoman Rapp and her committee on Act 44. And I think Chairwoman Rapp's comments indicate, the legislature's intent of the provision, which we're talking about here. And I think it's really important that the commission consider her comments related to that issue. We submit these comments in an effort to lay the important groundwork to improve the final regulations over the life of the program, much like the department proposes periodic regulations related to hospitals or long-term care. Through the proactive use of the regulatory process, we look forward to collectively continuing to improve the Commonwealth's already robust medical marijuana program. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Commissioners, I reserved my comments on the two other regulations. I thought we were just going to do the two labs. So whenever you're ready, I can launch into the two other regulations.
Yeah, and let's, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman.
No, fine.
We're going
Two
to, we'll do questions here first and then go on.
Ms. Buettner, you didn't say whether your organization wants these regulations rejected in toto today. What is your organization's position?
Our organization's position is that we're ready to move to the final, the true final regulatory process and begin the experience of the final regulations and move forward with the Department of Health working on them individually.
Bring the process to a conclusion
Bring the
today.
process to a conclusion after 6 years.
Thank you.
Yes.
I don't understand that answer completely.
We're asking for approval today.
Thank you. Is that?
A non-lawyer, I couldn't say it better. Thank you.
I do have a couple of questions. I mean, for me, it's having to weigh the outstanding issues versus a process that has been temporary regulation after so that there is at least some certainty at some point in time. And that for me is difficult. There were some things I don't understand, and Judith, if I can address them to you, and I hope you don't mind my using your first name. You mentioned a conflict, and based on what I thought I understood you were saying, I don't understand how there would be a conflict if the product at the initial test is entirely different from the product at the final test. If it should fail either test, it would seem to me it's no good at that point. And that's vernacular. I don't know what the term is for them to use. So I don't see a conflict. I think, my opinion, based on what I'm understanding, and I want you to be able to comment back to me, is that it would have to be approved under both tests in order for the department to approve it going forward. So let's start with that.
Thank you for the question. The conflicts it's not a pass-fail always. And for instance, the issue of concern with the DOH, or the one they've expressed, is THC levels. So at the plant stage, you would have one THC level, and the finished product would have a different THC level. Neither is necessarily wrong or right on its face, but if you if the intention of having this two different lab testing is so that you can provide checks and balances, you have two different results, who's right, who's wrong? Do you then get DOH involved at that point to try to figure it out? Do you have a third lab weigh in on? I mean, it's two different products at two different phases. They're going to have two different THCs. So what is the point of the checks and balances? And you're right. If this lab in the beginning finds pesticides or contaminants, mold, it fails. They'd have to destroy the product. There's no secondary test. We're talking about instances where it passes the first test and then might fail or have a different result in the second one. Who's right? Who's wrong? Did something happen during the process to change it? We don't know.
Would it only not be an issue, how do I want to say this? Would it only be an issue if what they found in the second test, which is different than what they found in the first test, is of such significance that it would lead to a disapproval?
We don't know.
Would it make a
We don't know.
difference? in
Well, the
between?
labs are regulating
All right,
each other, so I guess
can-
the labs can decide, right?
I will ask them that.
May I comment on your
Yeah.
first question? Thank you. So Judy's absolutely right. So what happens sometimes is, these customers have validated processes. So they know that when they extract flower by the validated process, they expect to see something in the end. They know what they expect to see. And sometimes the labs don't find what they think they should see. And as it stands, we can work with them and go back to those initial results and examine them and try to understand maybe what went wrong. Was it on our end, on their end? Maybe something happened in the second test in the processed product, and we can examine that and help understand maybe their extraction wasn't complete the way they thought it would be, something like that. With two labs doing this testing, you've eliminated any possibility of doing that examination. Our ISO requirements require confidentiality. So we can't share with another lab, nor do we have any motivation to do so as a private business.
Sure.
To our detailed SOPs to say, oh, well, this is what we did. Of course, they're going to point finger. Every lab's going to say it's the other lab. It's going to be chaos. And there was another point. Oh, with the contaminant testing, very often we hear in states that we operate in, we fail a customer for a contaminant and they say, well, we tested it at the other lab and they didn't find it. So what's going to happen then? They're just going to go test at the lab that's not finding any of the contaminants. Because why wouldn't you? You want to pass your product. So this is, and how is the DOH going to be involved? They're not. They've put this into an invisible hand of regulation. When has that ever worked? Are there any examples? I can't think of any.
We'll ask them that.
Sure.
I would love to comment on that from an operator's perspective, GP. And when we're sitting here talking about validation or double validation of tests, we have talked about a change of a harvest lot test to a final product, but we're also completely overlooking the fact that there is already a duplicative kind of test for harvest. And if we're moving a product that's just flour, we're already doing a test at harvest and then again at final process. And there hasn't been any time that there has been contradictory results in anything but THC potency. And that is a normal part of growing and testing a biological product versus a chemically oriented product, something that would be manufactured in a lab versus grown. So you're going to have degradation, you're going to have certain components of a flower that over time, if you're holding it in storage and you're sending it 3 months later for a final test product, that might have a reduction in THC potency. And we go with whatever is the most recent test because that is the most truest reflection of what that product is. But the way that this is being implemented is almost as if we ourselves as operators haven't moved through this process in the last 6 years with only temporary regulations to guide us, but also that all of the SOPs and all of the processes of highly complicated scientific processes that are implemented on a laboratory level we, from a grower processor standpoint, we go to those labs that we know that have consistent results, that are going to be able to explain the results, that can collect their samples with integrity and test them with integrity. And that's why we have contractual relationships and why we move between labs, to ensure that we have very consistent results that we know, as long as we're following our processes to preserve certain, potency and integrity of plants, that when we are sending it to the labs that we're working with, that they are also doing the same. And if we are subjected to a procedure that requires us to engage with a lab that maybe we don't trust their processes, again, how does it get resolved if one test prevails with or comes back with a different type of response, and we have to then decide, was there a contamination in the chain of custody? And none of that is really spoken to or overseen by the Department of Health at this point, nor is it proposed in the current regulations of how they would do that. So we now will find ourselves in the situation where we have before with our current seed to sale system, where all of the results get reported, where if there is conflicting information, our harvest, our products, our whatever get locked in a system and we cannot do anything with it. And it expires and costs our companies a lot of money to recreate those products, which ultimately increases patient costs only because there's a logistical or a technical issue that cannot be resolved with a seed to sale system. And that's our position from like a grower processor standpoint of the very critical level of attention that this needs, because the implementation of this regulation could grind this entire industry to a halt.
Let me ask this. If the two-lab system is so bad, and I don't mean that sarcastically, it's the only way I can describe what I'm hearing. If it was so bad, and the statute at the time provided for one in effect by saying you have a laboratory, why would the legislature then have amended it to say one or more? Why would they not have kept it at one?
I can address that.
Please, go ahead.
And I have a great example for you. New Jersey. Okay. New Jersey said you must contract with one lab. They only allowed one lab. So all the growers and processors went and contracted with one lab. Well, new labs came into the market, but they couldn't use those labs because they were contracted with one lab. They didn't like how those labs operated. They thought that the results were sloppy, it was taking too long, they didn't trust them. But they were contracted with the one lab that was required by New Jersey. It took a rule of the commission in New Jersey to allow them to contract with more than one lab. That was the intent of the legislature.
I see, but if the legislation itself did not pin you to a particular lab, which is what you're saying occurred in New Jersey, the statute at the time simply said one lab, and you could choose whoever you wanted as long as they were approved. And the difficulty for me is understanding if that is the ideal system, and the thought was out there of doing two labs, why would the legislature go ahead and say one or more when they could have maintained your position by leaving it the way it was?
To piggyback off of what Shannon said, if you're contracted with N laboratory and a new lab comes in, you cannot be you would have to break that contract to go to another lab. So possibly you want to send half of your products to this lab and half of your products to that lab. Maybe this lab's testing, it's more streamlined, and then you're going to switch labs. So this allows for, the free market to help us make our decisions about where we're taking products.
Okay.
And I'd like to address that there are certainly GPs who test with more than one lab. I think.
We do.
Yeah. And that's fine. And they make strategic choices about what they send to which lab. Perhaps they send their processed flour that they know is going to market as eventually as harvest flour that's eventually going to market as processed flour to one lab because their opinion is that that lab tests flour most reliably. And then perhaps they send their harvest flour that's going to be processed and then their processed products to another lab because it's their opinion that that lab tests that processed product most reliably, or myriad other reasons that they might choose to operate with multiple laboratories.
I'll even interject for something as simple as logistics here. We contract with more than one lab because one lab does their pickups on Tuesday and the other one does it on Friday, and we need to split our testing volumes, and we cannot wait because of the elongated product development concept to product implementation process to stall any longer because it has already taken us 6 months to a year to get products approved.
So then does that beg the question, well, how is this any different, right? How is this any different than a grower processor choosing? It's different in that the grower processor is choosing which products are going where because of their operational procedures, not because of some nonsensical regulatory requirement that will provide no benefit to anyone except for perhaps some laboratories that don't have any business now. So,
and to give you some, I know that we've talked about how no other state does the check and balance system of a laboratory, but I can tell you what other states do besides just the round robin. There are regulatory oversight bodies who, even under the current statute, I believe the Department of Health would have the permissibility if there was a sample that they felt was compromised, that they could investigate further from a laboratory side or from a grower processor side. That would allow them to investigate that sample. And so that way it puts the oversight back on the department instead of on each of the laboratories to have an oversight accountability to each other. And ultimately, the grower processors being beholden to a potential contradictory test result.
Round robin, that would not impact your business. So you wouldn't lose business as a result of it. You get more business.
Chairman, please. We don't get any pay for doing round robin testing. The state if a state requires us to do round robin testing, we don't get compensated for that. That's something that we do because it's you look confused. So let me clarify.
You represent a laboratory or a grower?
I represent a laboratory.
You don't get paid for testing?
Not by the state. So let me clarify. So what happens in some states is they will say, we're going to do round robin testing. We're going to give all of the laboratories the same sample, and we want you to test it for these tests. And then once we get the results.
How you're defining, sorry to interrupt, but let's define round robin testing.
Yes. Yes, that's my definition of round.
Define it, please.
Okay, round robin testing is when multiple entities test the same thing, and then the results are compared.
For the purpose of?
Understanding variability. So sometimes there might be like in proficiency testing, which is similar to round robin testing, but slightly different because in proficiency testing, same process, but there's a known value, and that known value is established by maybe multiple laboratories testing and establishing a known value or using certified reference materials to establish a known value. With round robin testing, it's slightly different in that there isn't necessarily a known value, a scientifically accepted value. But what would happen is they would compare the results and say, well, most of the labs, let's say, got 25% THC, but this one lab got 15% THC. So what's going on? Let's maybe take a look and see, is there something different about their process? Are their results accurate? Have they done proficiency testing by a third party on their potency method to ensure that their results are accurate?
So you potentially could end up with the same conflict.
But it wouldn't be for every single product that would go through. This would be like once a quarter or once a year that they would do a round robin testing of all of the credentialed labs. It wouldn't be for every single test.
Okay, so that's important to know. We're not talking about that all the time.
No, it's a suggested method for DOH to be regulating the labs instead of the labs regulating themselves.
I understand that, okay.
Yeah, so then the DOH could decide.
But they're doing, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I want to get back to my question. You're doing testing under a round-robin system. You do get paid to do that
No,
by somebody.
We are not, we don't do there's no round robin system in any states where all of the tests get tested by multiple labs, all of the samples. This is outside of the routine testing that's done as a regulatory. Yeah.
Can I help interpret? I think I know what you're saying and what you're saying. So the round robin is maybe once every 3 months. A single sample is sent to multiple labs, and then they report their tests. They don't get paid for that because that's kind of a regulatory exercise, happens once a quarter with one sample.
So you do it for free.
I mean, you can pay us to do it if you want, but yes, we do it
I'm
for
not
free.
talking about government, I'm talking about
It
them.
it doesn't come from the GPs. It comes from, but frankly, it does sometimes come from the GPs. Just recently, one of the GPs in another state evaluated all of the labs in the state, and one of the ways that they did their evaluation was with round robin testing. So they submitted the same samples to all the labs.
I believe I hit the end of my questions. Thank you. I would defer back to fellow commissioners if they have other questions.
I have a question, Mr. Chairman, of Ms. Moyer. Did I get it
Oh,
correctly?
that's what I should have done. I used your first name because my eyesight's so bad I can't read the things.
Well, she doesn't have a card.
I do not. Elusive over here.
There you
How can
go.
I help you, Commissioner?
Is it your position that we should approve these regulations today or reject the entire package?
From a GP standpoint, we need to move things forward and move things forward as they stand and be able to attack and revise individual chapters, subsections of the regulation. We have lived in temporary regulations for 6 years, and that's too long.
Thank you.
I'd like to, perhaps we could poll every member of the third panel that same question
That is, I think, more than fair.
That's right.
Yeah, that's, okay. Since the process that we're bound to is all or nothing, I mean, certainly, we, like a lot of the regulations.
Answer the question, please.
Yes, I would like all the regulations to be sent back to DOH so that this particular one can be corrected. Yes.
So you would ask for a disapproval?
Disapproval.
Disapproval.
Same, okay. And approval.
Approval.
Any other questions? Anyone else here who would like to comment from the public? Thought we'd have more.
I think there's.
Oh, I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
we
you
were
had
just trying
other
to finish up
issues,
the
yeah.
lab.
Yeah, I didn't want to move off the two lab until your commissioners were.
You're fine.
Okay.
I will say this, though, just as a cautionary thing, part of my problem when you had said take 60 days and fix that one issue is there are so many issues involved with this that, again, I don't know until I'm done how I'm going to vote on this one. But the more issues there are, the less likely it gets solved in 60 days. So I would just throw that caution out there, but you go ahead.
Thank you. I will be brief on the other two.
No problem, we have all day.
Oh, okay, great. I'm sure everyone here is thrilled that, okay, it was brought up when the Department of Health was speaking earlier, this what we call the terpene issue, it's the additive issue, where again, regulations were put forward, and then Act 44 was an amendment to the Medical Marijuana Act, where the legislature specifically provided not only that additives could be put into the medicine, but they gave very specific guidelines to the Department of Health on what they could use. They said if it's pharmaceutical, additives can be added, excipients can be added if it's pharmaceutical grade. If they're not pharmaceutical grade, then the department shall consider whether they're FDA approved for safe for food or what's called GRAS, generally recognized as safe. And it can't be also a known toxin or hazard. So that was the way the act was amended. DOH has since taken the position that not only does the product have to be, or the ingredient have to be safe for food as defined by FDA and or GRAS, but it also has to be approved by FDA for the route of administration. And what this really means is if you have any vaporized product, in medical marijuana, it needs to be approved by the FDA for vaporization. And as we all know, marijuana is still illegal under federal law, and therefore the FDA does not consider, let alone approve, ingredients in medical marijuana. And many of the vaporized products that we're talking about with medical marijuana only are contained in medical marijuana. So it's really an impossible standard that they've set up, and that's why we went to court, and we did win the preliminary injunction, which, if you are lawyers, and I don't know who is and who is not here, you know preliminary injunctions are extremely difficult to obtain because you have to prevail on all 6 criteria, 2 of which are you're likely to win on the merits, and you have a right to clear relief, which we did do. Now, I was happy to hear that the department today said that they don't plan to implement this particular regulation till the litigation is resolved. However, the industry is in a kind of a quasi weird place, because if you happen to have product approved prior to the litigation, and it was subject to that recall, then you can continue to make it and sell it. If, for instance, like my comrade here on the panel, want to go forward and make those kinds of products, you're not allowed. DOH will deny you the right to make those products. And so we're in this weird space that we aren't getting approvals for those types of products that are vaporized products that have these additives that are safe under FDA, safe for food or grass. Now, I will do 2 more facts here. One is, according to the witnesses that we put on, and they were pretty renowned witnesses, Dr. Sue Sisley is a doctor out of Arizona who is one of the very few scientists who have been approved by the FDA and the DEA to actually grow, produce marijuana and test it mostly on veterans, actually. So she testified that there has not been a single adverse event in the entire country with these additives in vaporized products. Not a single one in over 10 years, because it's been in these other states longer than it's been in Pennsylvania. That was very significant, and that was backed up by fact witnesses and other expert witnesses. And so that's an important part when we look at this overall regulation. The other is that we're in this quasi place where, unless the Department of Health is willing to say, hey, any product that comes forward that is in a similar situation as the products that were subject to the terpene recall, they can be approved pending the litigation. We have this really strange difference. I will add one more fact, just so when you are sitting across the table, you can have all the facts on this particular one. But the Department of Health is willing to approve products for vaporization with what we call botanical terpenes from, limonene and so forth, as long as those terpenes come from the medical marijuana plant. If they come from limonene, which is also from a lime, if you get it from a lime, they will disapprove you. This is nonsensical, and we also proved this in court, that a limonene is a limonene no matter where it comes from. It's like you can get your vitamin C in a pill, or you can get your vitamin C in orange juice. Vitamin C is vitamin C. And so we have that other kind of dichotomy that's not really meshing here with this particular reg. So we would ask that they go back to the language of the act that said, hey, as long as it is approved by the FDA safe for food or grass, that's the criteria that the legislature gave us. That's the one we would adhere to, and only that is in terms of approval. So we would ask for that. Any questions on that particular regulation before we move to the very last one?
I had asked the Department for confirmation in terms of how they would handle that issue, because I think it's an important issue. I will re-ask that. I assumed their answer was that their commitment would apply to new product also. But I will ask that question because I think it becomes, what I will say to you before you come up is, if the position is that you will apply that standard that has been enjoined in effect in another action, I understand, you're going to be in court the next week and have another injunction, and you're just going to waste time and money for everybody. And I'm probably out of line, I'm sorry, saying that. But in either event, I appreciate your comments, and it was enlightening for me.
Judith, before you move on, I'd love to add a little bit more with the additives. From a new product development standpoint, as we're moving products forward, medical marijuana is, it's a plant, just like many other, many other plants that are taken, chamomile, certain like teas, things like that people use that are very natural, like additives. And this brings up an interesting point when we're talking about additives, because there's so much focus on just the vaporization additives, or generally recognized as safe as food, or certain, characteristics that have been determined by the Department of Health in an approval or a denial for a future product. But yet, even when we've talked about moving forward with language for additives, there hasn't been any kind of clarity beyond what we're talking about with FDA and GRAS, which, not to get too verbose here, GRAS has not been revisited, or individual components have not been added to the GRAS lists since the 90s. So we're talking 30 years here where pharmaceutical companies are submitting things to the FDA with their individual ingredient lists of their internal tests that they have been running clinically or whatever, and they show the efficacy of being able to use, those individual ingredients without any kind of adverse event. Because there is not a mechanism that the federal government they don't have this plethora of personnel to be able to individually test every single thing that is safe for a person to ingest, or for a person to use for buccal, or for them to use for a sublingual or a subcutaneous, administration. There are so many different form factors that they actually use this directory that we're supposed to be based on. It's not that the FDA has determined it's safe. They have determined the end product as safe based upon all the other drug manufacturers' individual ingredients, and it's a directory of those individual ingredients. So it's actually not the FDA determining that it's safe for that administration method. It's all of the other operators that have lived in that drug manufacturing space that have done the research and presented it to the FDA. So for us to be held to this standard of pharmaceutical test companies that create and manufacture, chemically created ingredients, when we're sitting here talking about plants, it's a very different conversation here that we're comparing apples to oranges in a lot of situations. So that the bare bones of the actual additive language without proper resources. I mean, we're not talking about a reference to a dietary supplement directory. We're not talking about all of these other things that also exist under the purview of the FDA. We're only talking about pharmaceutical companies as a resource point for us to use. And there's just no practical application in our field to be able to use a lot of those ingredients. It's just not going to be formidable for our products. So
when you get to the substantive stage of your case, you should call her to testify.
I know, she's good, isn't she?
Yeah, go ahead.
Nikki brings up a good point, though, that the Department of Health brought up eval. I think it was before, linking this whole conversation to the vape crisis of 2019, that they're unrelated. This Department of Health secretary at the time even came out with a public statement saying, we've had no incidents in the medical marijuana industry of any kind of vape product causing these kinds of injuries. Those were illicit market type of things. This market that we're in right now is very heavily regulated. And as you can see today, we're all for regulation as long as it's direct and it makes sense. So I just wanted to bring that up, that those two are not the same thing. We don't have the eval problem in medical marijuana at all.
You don't have the what problem? You're speaking so quick.
I'm sorry, I think it's called eval.
EVALI.
EVALI. It is if you've heard in the news in about 2019 that people were dying of using vape products.
It had to do with vitamin E acetate within vaporization products, which essentially degraded the pockets of your lungs and things like that. Like, that is what created the vape crisis, and that was a result of black market vapes or things that were in e-cigarette juices, so to speak, not medical marijuana and not the marijuana industry.
And I'd just like to add that that concern could be easily addressed in the Pennsylvania market by adding vitamin E acetate to the testing requirements, which it was added to most markets. And I think I think I can safely say hundreds of thousands of tests across the markets that we test, and we have never detected it in any medical markets or recreational markets that exist in the states that we test in.
I'll finish up if no one has any questions on that part.
Any questions? Nope, go ahead.
I'm actually going to comment now on a regulation that wasn't promulgated, but we desperately need it. And I think all four of us would agree on this.
That, you can say what you have to say, but so you understand, that is outside the scope of what we can consider. But feel free to make your comment. I just want to make sure you're aware that we can only deal with what's in front of us and not what they chose not to send to us.
That's fair. Thank you for that guidance. And I just want to bring this up because I think it's so important to everybody here, and hopefully it's important to DOH as well. So if you do send the regulations back to them to consider if these other regulations that we're talking about today, perhaps they will add this one. We think that it should be what's called a deemed denied. Most agencies have deemed denied. And for anybody who may not be aware of what that means, it's simply that when you're asking for an approval, whether it be for a new product, or whether it be for a change in your facility or marketing, can we market this product, can we do this educational event, that the Department of Health would have 60 days to address that and respond, whether either way, granted or denied, approved or denied. And if they felt they needed more time, they could say, we want another 30 days. And either at the end of the 60, if they don't ask for the 30, or the end of 90, if they've asked for the additional 90, and it's not approved, it's deemed denied. Whatever we're asking for is deemed denied. And the reason that is very important is because it still gives DOH 100% control over approving and denying everything. It doesn't take anything away from them. Even if they forget to address us, it's deemed denied. However, it allows us to move forward with an appeal. I wasn't joking earlier or even being hyperbolic when I said that the Department of Health is in excess of 6 months behind in approval process, not only approving marketing and approving new products and approving facility alterations, but they're behind in just approving employees to start working. And everybody understands the importance of jobs and employing people in this economy. And if you have to wait as a business 3, 6, 9 months to make sure that your employee can work, that employee's probably moved on. And so they've made some concessions about, your employee can start working before approval, but they have to be chaperoned. Well, that does you no good if you have to take an employee to chaperone around the new employee for 6 months. It's the same as not hiring the new employee, and it's a waste of money, frankly. So all I'm suggesting is that it's a reasonable regulation. Come up with some time frame. If you don't like the 60-30, come up with another time frame, but allow people to move on with these decisions. Thanks. Thank you very much for your time.
And again, just so we're clear, if we were to send it back, and again, I think it's an excellent suggestion, and I mean that sincerely. If we were to send it back, they could not add that. They can only come back with changes that respond to the reasons why we disapproved, and we can only disapprove based on what's in front of us. But again, I think it's a great suggestion, and at least they've heard it, so.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Hearing none.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'll ask once again if anybody else is here from the public who wants to testify or actually make a presentation. We don't do testimony. And we'll ask the department to come back. You're free to respond to everything. I would ask initially, though, that you address the additive issue and how how you intend to handle that going forward on approval processes.
Sure, thank you. First of all, I'd like to say that really appreciate the acknowledgement from the the commenters that the department really is interested in working with our stakeholders. So we seek stakeholder input, and as you heard, are responsive to that input that we get. So this is an ongoing process. We expect to continue to work together and make adjustments in the program. This is a new program, and we're trying to keep patients safe, but we have to work together to do that. The first, in terms of the vape products, again, we are abiding by the court's order, and we will continue to do that. While we're abiding by the court's order, we are not approving or disapproving any new products until we have the result of that. Also, in our regulation, you would see that we list what we consider in terms of the additives. That's not an exhaustive list, so it does not mean that only those that are on that FDA list that are considered. That's one of the things that we use to make that decision, and it's just memorialized in that regulation.
So what you're saying is you won't approve any new product?
Until the
Court decision
decision is
Even
made.
if you were to get a product that didn't contain,
Yeah, I would like to clarify. It's vaporized products with added substances are, until the end of the litigation, will be pending to address the statutory authority question that's still on the merits. Or
that's problematic to me, but go ahead.
Other questions on the vaporized products with additives?
I would just like to add, when it was stated limonene is limonene, the issue is that food grade limonene and limonene that is endogenous to the plant itself are different. They're not coming from the same source. So I'm not saying that it isn't safe necessarily, but I'm saying we would have to factually know that it was, especially for something that's going to be inhaled. So as an additive, if it's a food grade additive, but you're inhaling it, it's the same as saying it's safe for other routes. You wouldn't put it in your eye as an ophthalmology ointment or something like that. So it has to be considered case by case and what that additive is and where the source of it came from.
How many applications, and I'm not sure if that's the term in terms of what you get, for approval of new product would involve the specific issue of additives and everything else that the court has said no to at this point?
Inhaled products with additives. I didn't look at the number before I came today. I apologize.
No, that's nothing to apologize for.
We would like to just note that the department receives numerous requests daily for different types
variety.
of products and other applications.
Just a rough idea. Is it a lot of them? Is it just a few?
We do receive a lot of vaporization product requests, but not all of them have the added substances, which are the overall.
Okay, you've answered as best you can.
But
Go ahead.
I would like to, if you're done with your question.
Yes, I am.
Okay. I would like to just add that at this time, no court opinions have stated that we don't have the statutory authority. And while the preliminary injunction was approved, I want to just add that the first element of that is the clear right to relief prong, which is that they raise a substantial argument that could be seen. It's not on the merits, and at this time, we have not been deemed not to have what we believe.
Understood. I know one of the presenters that was here earlier said they weren't aware of how many lawyers were on the panel. It's probably not a good thing, but all 5 are, so we understand the injunctive process. Go ahead, please.
Any more questions on the vaporized products with additives?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. So if I could address the 2 lab testing, I think that it was a wonderful suggestion that the OH have regulatory authority to do those inspections of the lab and setting standards, but we don't have that. And so we have to operate within the statutory authority that is within the Act. I also want to talk about what the testing is not. We heard about the comparing one test's value to the other and what those discrepancies were. Our overarching directive is patient safety. What we're trying to prevent are contaminants. So if a sample is tested and it has pesticides or mold or yeast, we want that to fail and not pass. And so if that testing occurs and that product still has yeast and still has mold, when it goes on to the next step, we want to make sure that there's not a persistent contaminant. We're not asking labs to expose their proprietary methods. We're not asking them to compare sample at one part of the processing to the next. We want to make sure that there's not going to be a transmission of mold or contaminants that can harm patients from one test to the other. I think we've heard that yes.
I'd like you, while you're focusing on this.
Yes.
But I think what's pertinent to me, perhaps other members of the commission, is how does specifically the employment of multiple labs address that?
Sure.
We understand the medical, scientific, and patient safety considerations that are animating what you're doing. But the issue for today, at least in part, is a requirement that that testing protocol not be carried out by one lab, but by two labs. And speaking personally for the moment, I understand, have no problem with the idea that there's going to be, I guess as the term is used, there's going to be harvest lot testing, and then there's going to be process lot testing. May very well be a very good scientific and medical reason to have this repetitive testing. Completely get it, completely get the orientation on safety, patient safety, the medical issues. But the issue of the day on this question is, why is there a mandate to have that two different forms of testing carried out by two different labs? And what is your statutory authority to make that requirement in the face of language that, as I said before, simply says one or more? That would seem to be logically an option for the industry or for any grower producer to use one or more than one, but not a mandate that more than one would have to be required, because logically there are very easy constructions of language that would make that clear beyond a doubt. Might not be supportable by standards of Act 44, but if that was the intent, we know what words could make that very clear. I'm not seeing that. That's where we need more help from you.
So in terms of what we expect from the lab testing, what we're trying to prevent is a sample that is passed erroneously that contains contaminants, so yeast or mold or other contaminants, and then goes on to the next step, and that is not detected, that there still are contaminants. And so that this is our proactive approach to prevent that carry on of contaminants that can harm a patient, to make sure that there is at least another check. We don't have the authority. Yes.
At risk of interrupting you.
Yes.
Isn't that check achieved by having, in the first instance, what's described as harvest lot testing, and then in the second instance, what's described as process lot testing? What you're not addressing is why that is better carried out by a requirement of having a different lab involved in each step. That's the issue. Can someone please address this?
Let me try.
Thank you.
You had heard previously from the commenters that sometimes they choose a lab specifically because they feel it's more reliable. But insidiously and nationwide, there is some, for lack of a better word, cahoots between maybe GPs and labs. If you're using one lab and we're friends and my test fails and then it passes on the second one, there can be financial agreements between people that benefit them to manipulate or those lab results. So it increases competition and also honesty, where you have one lab gets a result, does the second lab get that same result or a different result? They don't have a hand in, there's no reason for those two people to be in that situation.
Earlier, using the terminology round robin.
Right. So,
Something that was used but never explained.
and let me
Is that
just,
what that means?
getting stuck on the round robin, by definition, is actually a tournament in which each competitor plays in turn against each other. And we did also hear that some of the labs are already contracted, or the GPs are contracted with multiple labs. And I'm not implying that it's because there's something going on there. Some of them like their pickups done on certain days. That's completely reasonable. But what we're trying to do is proactively address what could be business arrangements that would benefit on either side. I'm bringing you my business because you have the best results, or the highest THC, or I always pass for mold, or something like that. They can choose as many labs as they like and call it round robin. I'm not saying you only have to do two. If you want to round robin your products, you can do that anytime you would like. But it's a proactive approach to not end up like other states where you're talking about popular labs, but why are they popular? Is it for good reasons or is it for bad reasons? So this way, it's a competition between labs to make sure that everybody stays honest.
But as a matter of clarity, what you're proposing and what was discussed as a round robin are two different things.
It would have to be, there's two things to that. Every single lab would have to have that sample. We're saying two. So it's a virtual
But
choice.
a round robin would occur only at one point in the process.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, so to clarify, because they're saying that we're making them do the job for them. The department set the standards. The way the system works is one laboratory would test the harvest lot. They don't see each other's results. It moves forward, and then a separate laboratory tests the other one. So we set the standards, they did the test, and then we review, because if the first test passed, then, and it had failed yeast mold, which is what the department's major concern is, and then goes to process, and at that process test, it fails, then it triggers the quarantine failed product.
I
And
understand,
so-
unless I misunderstood, and correct me if I did, what Commissioner Sirocco is asking is simply a comparison to what is a round robin versus what you're proposing. Am I accurate or inaccurate? If I am inaccurate, don't hesitate, I've been wrong before.
I'm just in part asking what sort of definition of round
Round
robin
robin.
testing as one or more witnesses have been using that term.
So, yes, if I might clarify, this is not strictly a round robin. As one of the commentators mentioned, a round robin is when you're using one sample and sending to all of the labs. So we're not quite talking about round robin. What we're talking about is having a second lab do tests on that sample to make sure that it hasn't failed for yeast and mold, and that was not detected. If a sample does not have yeast and mold, we don't expect it to have those contaminants at the second time. So we want to make sure that we're protecting our patients, and there are multiple examples nationwide where vulnerable patients, like our medical marijuana patients, are getting contaminants in their product, and we have to do all that we can to protect patient safety. And we think that this is not an overburdensome undertaking. Again, we've heard that grower processors are using multiple labs. We know that they already require 2 lab tests, and so this is not overly burdensome over what they're already doing.
I would just,
When you use the term two-lab test, Doctor, it's explain what you mean by that?
Sure. So right now, the grower processors have to have those two tests done, one at harvest, one at process. What we're saying is that those two tests are done by two separate labs instead of just the one lab that they're using. So there may be an incremental cost for volume discounts, but they're still having those two tests done.
So you're saying, and I understand what you're saying, Doctor, is that some grower processors are already doing what you interpret the regulation to require.
I can't say that. I know that they're using more than one lab. They're using more than one lab, but whether or not they're using more than one lab to split the tests, we don't know that.
I think you may have misspoken. I thought you
Yes.
were, what's specifically at issue here, I think we're all agreed on this, is the notion that for test 1, lab A.
Yes.
For test 2, not lab A, lab B.
Correct.
No one's questioning the requirement of there being test 1 on the one hand and test 2 on the other hand.
Correct.
No one is questioning your authority, department's authority, to put forward a regulation reflecting that. The question is whether the language of one or more independent laboratories can support a regulation that requires that the two separate functions be carried out by two separate laboratories.
Correct.
That's where the folks, that's what we're talking about.
I was gonna say, so part of that is the commentators made a couple of statements that the department has so much authority over the labs to do this, that, and the other. The department has limited authority over the labs.
You've already lost me with what you just said, and I want to understand it very.
Yes. So I didn't quote the specific statement, but they said the department has the ability to go in, get everything from the labs, enforce them the way they would essentially the grower processors. But the entire act itself does not give the department the amount of oversight over the laboratories that it does over the grower processors. And so the department is doing what it can within the act to make sure that it can address this very real concern, and that section is essentially really the only laboratory section that's in the act itself. Even when it comes to the penalties section of the act, it doesn't mention laboratories like it enumerates every other position. And so at this point, with what we are given, the department saw after the General Assembly amended it, seeing all these comments, that it bolstered the interpretation that the General Assembly was giving us the deference to determine whether or not if we decided to do that, if that was the right way to go. And I would also like to clarify that there's been determinative weight being given to the second sentence of this 704 language, where it says the department has to approve a laboratory and give the reporting requirements. That's intention of the rules of statutory construction. We all know that these, especially complex, are very erroneous, and the General Assembly is not going to take the time to fix plural and possessive in section 1902 of the construction. Specifically says that the plural is supposed to be singular and the singular means plural.
I mean, the way if I were to take that language literally, that to me would mean, if I had to interpret it literally, that you would only approve one laboratory in the entire state. The second sentence.
So that's obviously not, because the department has been approving, exactly. So that's why we're doing the singular plural, because the department has approved multiple laboratories. And to the contracts clause allegations, the department's not telling them which of the approved laboratories who have to meet these standards to choose from. There are several to choose from. And if the permittees in their contracts, which again, how they draft those contracts with those laboratories are business decisions. If it's proven to be impossible to comply, then at the department will obviously wait until the conclusion of that contract. But to just say that they don't have the ability to contract with whoever ignores the fact that they have a plethora of the other laboratories to choose from, and we're not telling them which one they have to choose from. We're just saying, hey, you have one laboratory, please pick one of these several other laboratories, and you get to choose whichever.
And I would just like to say that,
Question is, at least in my mind, perhaps in the mind of other commissioners, is not that it's impossible to do, but is there in Act 44 anything that can be pointed to as a requirement that it must be done in that way? It might be a very medically and scientifically sound thing to do, but you've got to help at least me a little bit more with where you see in the language of Act 44 a mandate that a different testing lab must be employed at these two different tests. I understand the importance of testing. I understand the importance of the two different tests. I understand the importance of testing integrity. But where do I look to find the authority that requires a different lab to be used at each time? And I don't even question the fact that it's necessarily an economic issue. I understand you have to have this testing. That isn't the concern. I think the concern, as has been pointed out by the letter I'm sure you saw from members of the legislature, where in Act 44 do you have the justification for a requirement that a different separate lab be used at each of these two steps?
Commissioner, if I may.
She said, this is about Chief Counsel.
Good afternoon now. My name is Yvette Kostelak. I'm the Chief Counsel at the Department of Health. Commissioner, I'm aware of the issues that have been raised with the language in question. I wanted to point out that that language is not the only language in this statute that the department is dealing with. The legislature very clearly set out in the sections relating to policy and intent that we are required as the department to make certain that this is a safe program, and we need to do what we need to do to take care of that. We have very little statutory authority to do much with the labs. The language that concerns you, I would point out that the department does have discretion unless we are clearly erroneous to interpret that language. So it doesn't, I don't believe that the language needs to set out a mandate. You must require that two labs or whatever. It gives us the ability to look at that language and determine that given the policies in that statute, we are doing what we need to do to make sure that the product is safe. I will say nothing in that language says that it's up to the grower processor to choose, the way I read it. The department has the discretion to make a decision about what should happen with those labs, and that's what we're doing, given the language of the intent of the statute. I'd also point out that we did get a letter from members of the committee, but the committees themselves have deemed the regulation approved. Presumably, had they had a concern with our statutory authority to do what we're doing, they would have asked to review the regulation further, or they would have disapproved, but they have not.
Yeah, but we have that.
You do as well, but the question as well is, what is the intent of the legislature? So I would suggest that, given the fact that they've deemed them approved, they agree with how we have interpreted their intent. Now, of course, that's up to you to decide whether I'm right or wrong, but I do think we have the authority to do what we've done, and that's the position we've taken.
If I can ask one question on, it was indicated the process with the community, I'll call them commitments, I forget what the exact term is, that they can be sanctioned for that without the ability of raising extenuating circumstances. My question is, isn't there a due process in place that we would have to go through where they could, in fact, raise defenses COVID. I mean, how are you going to meet those things during a period where we were locked in our houses?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman, for raising that. There is a process for our permittees to submit any updates. And so that they're required, if there are any substantial changes to their community impact plan, that they could submit those. So that is a process that's in place. And so that we would not expect an organization, a permittee to be sanctioned if they've had to make a change, because they would have updated us on the change and would have had the opportunity to have feedback. So so there is a process for ongoing communication to avoid those sanctions or penalties.
I would just like to add to your due process question specifically that any action taken by the department under GRAP in our Chapter 20, I think it's our Chapter 12 regulations, they do give the permittees the ability to appeal, so any action taken.
Thank you. Anything else you want to?
I have a question.
Oh, sorry, Dan.
I'm not sure who to address this through, but whoever's the appropriate representative of the department. And I want to determine what was the genesis for the 2-lab requirement? And I'll pose it this way. You've explained that you want to protect the integrity of the process and the integrity of the product. And the evidence elsewhere in other states that sometimes the grower processors and a single laboratory may find it in their collective best interest to work together in some fashion that may not be in the best interest of the patient. But it was suggested by 2 commentators today, or asked rhetorically, was the 2-lab proposal a proposal from a lab that doesn't already have business in an effort to give a non-approved lab business? And I just want to find out in the regulatory process whether that issue was ever raised, or any of the 3 of you ever heard such an idea, that the 2-lab proposal was the result of a non-approved lab asking to put the provision in.
Certainly not. Again, permittees would contract with our approved lab, so that a non-approved lab would have no standing in there, would not be able to have any business in there. And I think we mentioned only a couple of problems in states nationwide, but the issue is widespread. And again, we are taking care of patients who are already sick and vulnerable. We've got a duty to protect them. But this is a real problem, and it has been widespread. And we want to protect our program from those problems that we've seen.
During the regulatory process, was it ever suggested by any participant that the basis for the department suggesting a 2-lab requirement was to give business to a presently unapproved lab?
I'm just going to take this one.
Or was this the first
No.
time that you heard about it was today?
This was the first time that we've heard that this was the accusation of it. During the process, that it did not start from a lab assumingly not getting the business. In fact, small laboratories, I think, provided comments that they thought it would mess with their business themselves too. This was based off of the limited statutory authority of the enforcement over labs and the nationwide issues that have been seen for a minimum of 5 years.
Have you been involved in this throughout the regulatory process, Attorney Turner?
I have been involved in it since after proposed, but I have also worked with the previous attorney before and in discussing why this was made. Not once had she ever said it was based off of a laboratory asking for
So
it.
there's no basis in fact of any of this suggestion today that
My knowledge, there's no basis in fact.
Thank you very much. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
That's an excellent questions, and I'm glad you asked those. I had forgotten about that. I would clarify that I wouldn't I didn't view it as an accusation as such, but rather it was raised as a possibility, or as Commissioner Watson suggested, said it could be a suggestion that it's a possibility out there. So I would just clarify that it.
Mr. Chairman, I wasn't making any accusations, but the questions were asked rhetorically as to the motivation of the department, and I think it's important that we drill down and find out whether that was the motivation of the department.
Absolutely. I, in fact, indicated that you characterized it correctly. The response
Yeah, I
was
called it
an accusation.
An accusation. I apologize for that.
No
and
problem.
I would also just like to clarify, previously, when we were talking and just saying yeast and mold, we do mean all regulated contaminants. I know that we've jumped from that, but it's important to note that, especially since yeast and mold can be remediated into a topical.
Okay. Anything else? Any other questions? And the other parties haven't joined us, so I want to make sure they have.
I should mention that Commissioner Meisner is the monitor, so we'll need a motion from somebody else.
Okay. Thank you very much. Commissioners feel they need any additional time to think through? Is there anybody that has not come forward that had intended to? Seeing none. Thanks for the reminder. I will make the motion in weighing all the pros and cons, and in fairness, both sides raised what I consider to be substantial issues. I am going to move to approve finding statutory authority, intent, and public interest. And the main factor for me is I understand the arguments back and forth on the laboratory issue. It's enough to have me confused as a result, so I can't make a decision that it's not statutorily, at least within the department's discretion. And overall, I just feel it's in the public interest that some permanent regulation get into place rather than continuing along with temporary regulations. I would fully expect that the department will work with those who are opposed to approval today, assuming it is approved. And I don't know how everybody's going to vote. I had trouble making my own mind up. But that you would continue to work with them to address the issues they've raised, which I think are legitimate concerns. And it would seem to me there's got to be a way that you can arrive at a process that works for everybody. But having said all that, I would move for approval.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to second the motion, if I can make some comments.
Absolutely.
If I may. I think it's the defining question here is whether these regulations are in the public interest, and I believe they are. I believe that the department has put forth a very credible explanation as to why we're here and why it's taken so many years to get here. I also note that two of the non-departmental commentators also believe it's in the public interest to adopt final regulations and move from the temporary regulations that have regulated this industry for so many years in the Commonwealth. I think that with respect to the one or more references that is consumed a considerable amount of discussion today. I believe the department's explanation is reasonable, and I think it is within its discretion to interpret it in the manner that it has. Also, in hearing the criticism of the department, based upon my review of the regulations and understanding how they work, I don't find that these regulations to be egregious, create irreconcilable confusion, or be disruptive to the industry. The suggested alternatives that the department handle the regulation in some fashion, I believe the department has provided a credible explanation. It does not have the authority to handle it in the manner that some of the commentators have suggested. Mr. Chairman, as I stated, I believe that these regulations are in the public interest. It's time to move on with the final regulations. I concur in your remarks, and as also one of the commentators said, it is important that the regulated community work with the department to continue as they address issues going forward. But I also note that among the various comments we've received, including the letters that we looked at today, that part of the regulated community is not just the people in the manufacturing portion of the industry, but also the patients who are using this product. And there is a large amount of concern about the integrity of the products, and they are looking to the department to protect their interest as well. And so that's important that all the people or all the components of the regulated community take into consideration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Do you want to make comments or make them when you cast your vote? It's your choice.
The latter, thank you.
The latter? Okay. It's been moved and seconded that the regulation be approved. Maddie, if you would call the roll.
The motion has been made for approval of Regulation 3290. Commissioner Uthberg.
Proxy, aye.
Vice Chairman Meisner.
With Vice Chair Meisner's vote, I just want to point out that from time to time when we have commissioners who cannot participate in the discussion, they will opt not to vote on a controversial or important regulation because they've lacked the benefit of the discussion at the meeting. And in this case, Vice Chair Meisner abstains on this regulation.
Commissioner Watson.
Aye.
Commissioner Sirocco.
I'd like to make a statement first.
Absolutely.
Look, in my judgment, I make the observation that requiring separate labs to do harvest lot testing, as it's been described on the one hand, versus process lot testing on the other hand, may be a very sound idea from a scientific and or medical point of view, and I take no position on that. But in looking at the language in question, a requirement to contract with, quote, one or more independent laboratories is something I have a great deal of difficulty squaring with an interpretation that language is in effect a legal requirement or mandate that separate labs perform those two different tests. In my judgment, Act 44, which is the underlying enactment from the legislature, a difficult time logically interpreting it to support an absolute requirement that harvest lot on the one hand and process lot testing on the other hand must be performed by two different labs, which I understand is the position being taken by the department. I would hope that the department would give some studied consideration to reconsidering its position in that regard. I certainly think it gives the industry the option to do exactly that. The question is whether there is a legal mandate to be imposed upon the industry in that regard. I have a very difficult time getting to that point, but on an overall basis, and looking at this regulation in its totality, looking at the history of how it has progressed to get to this point with my reservation about the two-lab testing very much in my mind. I would yet vote to approve the regulation, but would ask the department to take a very serious look at its two-lab position. I find the justification of that position to be really insufficient, but I would vote to approve on the basis that, on an overall basis, this regulation speaks to product safety, patient safety, is in the public interest, and my vote would be a vote of approval with the reservations I voted, which I hope the department would take seriously.
Chairman Bedwick?
I would just emphasize what Commissioner Sirocco has said, and on that particular issue, I would urge you to please work with the regulated community to try and arrive at something that everyone believes is, and I'm not saying your process isn't workable, but there's been suggestions that it might not work even from a practical standpoint. And I think it was right on the commissioner's part to urge you to work with them to see if you can work out a process that works for everybody in a good way. With that, as I indicated, find overall the regulation to be in the public interest, and I vote for approval. My vote is yes.
The motion passes 4-0.
Thank you very much. Our next order of business is approval of the vouchers that were submitted. Have the commissioners had an opportunity to review those?
So moved.
It's been moved for approval. All second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. 3-0. David, anything I've forgotten?
No executive session today.
Okay. We are scheduled to hold another meeting next Friday, the 28th, here in this room at 10 a.m. I don't know if we have any additional items other than the long-term care regulations?
For long-term care.
Here, and nothing else on that agenda.
Correct. And for those of you who may be confused, we had moved the meeting to 11, but it's now back to our normal start time at 10.
Yeah, correct. With that, we do not need an executive session. Unless any commissioners have any other issues or concerns they want to raise, I will adjourn the meeting.
Well done, George.
Yeah, that was. You did it. The way you said it.
Just wanted to clarify, I mean, I think it did, we were in the last.